Earlier today, we had the entire SEC in front of the Senate Banking Committee. And while a lot of people are likely going to say nothing came out of this, I actually do believe we learned something very important. In this video, I want to talk about the dramatic shift we are seeing in the SEC right now and what I believe it means for the Ripple SEC case going forward. Guys, remember, we were only 2 weeks away from finding out whether or not this case is dead and gone or the SEC is going to try to rehash this thing. In this video, I want to talk about what we learned from this SEC hearing because I believe it does give us some indication of what comes next. I also want to talk about towards the end of the video something very exciting that is definitely going under the radar. In my opinion, this drastically increases the chances we are in the next bull market. Like always, your support means so much to this channel. Thank you to everyone who takes the time to like these videos and subscribe to the channel. These two simple things really do help me out so much. Also, if you have any good place to buy some XRP, make sure to check out my favorite exchange Uphold down in the description of this video. With that said, let's jump right into it, and I hope you guys enjoy the content. I'm going to start this video off and just share a couple highlights with you from the SEC hearing earlier today, because there really were some pretty great moments. Now, this thing was 4 to 5 hours long, so if you didn't watch the entire thing, you likely missed out on the best parts. They were few and far between, but there really are some parts you absolutely need to see because Gary Gensler got put on blast like many of us wanted. But more importantly, after I show you guys the highlights, I want to share with you my takeaway because I really do believe there is a dramatic shift happening, and it's something that I didn't really anticipate going into this thing. So I want to start off and show you the number one highlight from this entire thing. And as many of you guessed, it is Tom Emmer. Now, I still have critiques of Tom Emmer because ultimately all he really is doing is yelling at Gary Gensler. There hasn't really been any action. But to a certain degree, there's really not much he can do as a single person. And he really is passionate about the things he's saying. There is no question in my mind that Tom Emmer really dislikes Gary Gensler. And I believe ultimately what he says here is still very powerful. I really do believe Tom Emmer is the most relatable person when it comes to how people feel about the SEC's current stance towards the cryptocurrency market. So listen up to this.
The SEC broke the law. Your attorneys lied to the court, and no one in your leadership here in DC has been held accountable. That tracks. Seems like business as usual here in Washington. Okay, switching gears very quickly. It's been recently reported that Vice President Harris has finally said she'd craft clear rules of the road for the digital asset space if she becomes president. Is this your approach too, sir, or do you think she's rebuking you because she doesn't think you've done a good enough job establishing clear rules over the last 3 years for administration?
I think that there's laws in place. Congress wishes to change them, but we are enforcing the laws, and there are many
reclaiming
people in
my
this
time.
field
So you don't
that are
think
not
she's
following
rebuking
the laws.
Reclaiming my time. Well, it's very interesting to do your performance that way because we have a litany of court cases, extraordinary confusion in the marketplace, and millions of Americans pining for clarity from you. You've abused the agency's enforcement tools, and you've even baited companies eager to comply with you, only to hit them with enforcement action. You've retaliated against businesses and people who have come before this committee to talk about the next generation of American finance. Perhaps somehow, worst of all, you've made up the term crypto asset security. This term is nowhere to be found in statute. You made it up. You never provided any interpretive guidance on how crypto asset security might be defined within the walls of your SEC. Yet, you made the broad proclamation that you believe a majority of tokens are crypto asset securities. You did this, and you would deliberately use this made-up term as the basis for your entire enforcement crusade over the past 3 years, only for your lawyers to retract it in a footnote to a court just last week. Your inconsistencies on this issue, sir, have set this country back. We could not have had a more historically destructive or lawless chairman of the SEC.
So I think that was pretty awesome and extremely well said by Tom Emmer. I think he hits on some of the most important issues that a lot of people feel. He touches on the digital asset security thing, which is obviously one of the biggest things the SEC is facing pushback on right now. It's something I talked about in my video last night, actually, because the SEC essentially brought the Ripple case under the assumption that courts would agree with them that there is such thing as a digital asset security. The SEC has faced massive pushback on that. And as Tom Emmer points out there, he's actually been forced to apologize for coming out and saying the term digital asset security. a digital asset security doesn't exist, this is a massive slap in the face of the SEC. Now, the one thing I'll say about that entire exchange is that Gary Gensler actually at one point did say the SEC failed in the debt bot case. So that is extremely interesting because it's one of the first times I've actually heard Gary Gensler come out and say that the SEC did a bad job in terms of the cryptocurrency regulations. We also hear that Gary Gensler is essentially admitting that a crypto asset security has never existed. So this right here is the first time we've really seen Gary Gensler walk back on some of these issues and admit that the SEC has been wrong-footed. I'll share one other thing with you that was extremely interesting because Hester Peirce was also on this panel with the SEC along with the other Republican commissioner. And every single time Gary Gensler would essentially lie to the market and say things that weren't true, Hester Peirce would come in and essentially tell the truth. Now, I think this is very important because there was a lot of Republicans and Democrats in this hearing that were pushing back on the SEC and Gary Gensler. But I think this was extremely important to see because what this proves is that this is not some issue that's really partisan. What we are seeing is that SEC commissioners are coming out and saying, hey, Gary Gensler is literally making this up. And we actually saw Democratic officials agreeing with the Republican SEC officials. This is so important to understand because this means that common sense is prevailing here, and even people who are in the same political party as Gary Gensler are coming away listening to him saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't check out. So I want to show you this one other clip before we get into my analysis of how this changes the Ripple SEC case moving forward and what I think we're going to see over the next 2 weeks on whether or not the SEC is going to appeal that case. First of all, listen up to this.
I think what's happening is that we're trying to be ambiguous because the legal precision carries with it real implications. And this is why people have been coming to us and saying we need clarity. Is the token itself a security? Or is it part of an investment contract? Is it being sold together with an investment contract? If it is, what is that investment contract and how long does it track along with the token? By using imprecise language, we've been able to sort of suggest that the token itself is a security apart from that investment contract, which has implications for secondary sales. It has implications for who can list it. And I think this is absolutely, we've fallen down on our duty as a regulator not to be precise. And so tucking into a footnote that, yes, we admit that now actually the token itself is not a security, that's something that we should have admitted long ago and then started wrestling with the difficult questions.
Right. So
there we see Hester Peirce essentially admitting that a digital asset security has never existed. It's not a real thing. And essentially the SEC did this to try to jam crypto legislation into their jurisdiction, despite the fact that obviously they were never given jurisdiction over the digital assets. So essentially what I think is happening is it is becoming more than obvious to everyone out there that the SEC does not have control over the crypto assets themselves. And I think what we're going to find out this week is whether or not the SEC is going to appeal the Ripple SEC case. The best argument I have heard for why the SEC might still appeal was that the SEC was waiting for this entire hearing to pass, and then after this hearing passed, they would appeal because essentially then no one would be able to ask questions about it. I think that's probably the best explanation I have heard on why they haven't appealed yet. Other than that, I think they would have done it, and I think we would have already seen that go through. I think the SEC is in too tough a position right now when it comes to the politics behind appealing. Like I said earlier, what we saw during this hearing was a lot of different people in the Democratic Party coming out against the SEC, one of them being Richie Torres. He specifically hit hard on the SEC's idea of the digital asset security. This was by far the thing they were getting the most pushback on, and it was one of the main core premises of the Ripple SEC case. I don't see how the SEC can come forward and continue pushing this narrative when they have essentially disproved their own narrative by admitting that the entire premise of the case they brought against Ripple essentially doesn't actually pan out when it comes to the law. And I think now we have enough politicians fully understanding the issue to realize, hey, this doesn't exist. We have now called the SEC out on it multiple times. It does not make sense to continue down this road. With the amount of times this has come up in the political landscape, with the amount of pushback people like Kamala Harris are getting because of Gary Gensler, I don't see how we can continue this issue forward. On a case that is so obvious as the Ripple SEC case and XRP not being a security, it seems like the worst case Gary Gensler could bring forward right now, and it's just going to have massive issues if he chooses to pursue it. I really do think if we do not see an appeal this week, we are likely in the clear. Now, I will preface that by saying there are a lot of smart lawyers who think the opposite, but I will continue to take the contrarian bet here. It seems like the more and more we learn, the more and more we see Gary Gensler walk back on these issues, the better and better chance we have of the SEC not appealing this case. Now, the other thing I want to say in terms of Gary Gensler's attitude during this entire thing was that he really stayed away from calling the entire industry rife with fraud. He really stayed away from the attacks. He really stayed away from a lot of negatives. It really does seem like he has been forced to change his tune when it comes to the crypto asset industry. It seems like he now realizes that he is really hurting his party politically, and it's time for him to actually start focusing on the frauds, the bad actors, rather than the good players. To me, this might not be what Gary Gensler wanted to do, but it's what he's being forced to do behind the scenes because they are losing too much voters, and this is something that was explicitly stated to him during this hearing. So my biggest takeaway from this entire hearing was that Gary Gensler is pivoting. Is it a hard pivot? No, but it certainly is a pivot. And I think while he still wants to be hard on the cryptocurrency industry, I don't think he can continue with this idea of let's hold it back at all costs. I don't think he can continue to go after the good players. I think there's too much pushback. I think what we are seeing in real time is that pivot. It certainly was more of a pivot than I was personally expecting. I was expecting him to come here and really double down. Personally, I don't think that's what I saw. I think Gary Gensler is really just trying to save his own face and realizing that when it comes to a lot of the actions we've seen before in the past, it's not materializing in terms of any kind of support from the people that matter within his party and the opposing party. So I think these are all very good signs for what's to come. And in my opinion, this makes me more confident that the SEC will not appeal the Ripple SEC case. Now, I want to finish this video off with one last thing, and I know I'm already way over time, so I'll cover this quickly. What we saw earlier today that is really going under the radar is that China is actually now injecting liquidity into their markets as well as cutting rates. What we are seeing is a global change in monetary policy towards looser monetary policy that is better for risk assets, and monetary policy that is going to allow markets to reach new highs. This is something that we have been watching for a very long time. And I have predicted many times the United States would certainly be cutting interest rates, but to see China and the rest of the world doing it at the same exact time, that might create a bullish scenario not even I was expecting. Very, very exciting to see this change in monetary policy on a worldwide scale. I had a good feeling it was going to come to the United States doing this, but the fact that we now see other major economies doing this as well alongside the United States, that could create a situation in which I believe this money that's been sitting on the sidelines, scared, chasing yield, is now going to be forced to be taken off the sidelines, look for places to be reinvested. And guys, with what we're watching in the cryptocurrency market, with the things we heard today in terms of the Senate actually looking to pass stablecoin legislation, it seems like we are watching a major shift in the attitude towards the cryptocurrency industry. This capital is going to need to find a place, and there's no more innovative industry out there than the crypto industry. Guys, thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this update, and for now, Mickle out.